The stylus was still warm. That was the detail that stopped Counselor Vethanara mid-stride, 3 paces from the signing chamber's threshold. The human delegation had been gone for 11 minutes. Their seats were cold. Their water vessels are untouched. But the stylus they had used to mark the acknowledgement document, the one piece of ceremonial participation the council had permitted them, was still warm, as if it had been held tightly for a very long time by something that ran hotter than expected. She set it down and said nothing. Behind her, the Grand Assembly was still applauding. The vote had not been close. 412 member species. The resolution to formally excise humanity from Galactic Council participation had passed with 389 in favor, 9 abstaining, and 14 who had voted against, all 14 of whom had immediately and quietly requested that their votes not be made part of the public record. That last detail would not seem significant until much later. By then, it would seem like the only significant detail. The charges against humanity were not, on paper, unreasonable. They had been presented methodically over the course of 6 council sessions spanning 2 galactic standard years. Humanity had violated 11 territorial delineation protocols, ignored 4 cease expansion notices, established 43 settlement clusters in regions explicitly marked as contested or under council arbitration, and most egregiously, in the view of the senior magistrates, had done all of this not through aggression or military force, but through a process that the council's own translators had initially rendered as stubborn administrative confusion. Before a second pass revealed the more accurate translation, willful procedural indifference. They hadn't broken the rules through warfare. They had simply acted as though the rules applied to someone else. They do not govern themselves, Ambassador Solon Taris of the Rithkai Dominion had said during the 3rd session. They cannot. They have hundreds of independent territorial governance structures that do not speak to one another in any coherent fashion. When we issue a directive to humanity, there is no single entity that receives it, acknowledges it, and enforces it. It vanishes into their system like a stone into deep water. The chamber had murmured in collective recognition. Every species with more than a century of council experience knew the type. They had encountered poorly organized civilizations before, civilizations that were more instinct than institution. The standard response was containment, followed by a structured integration period, followed, if the civilization proved incapable of meeting minimum organizational thresholds, by formal excision from participation until maturity benchmarks were achieved. Excision was not punishment. That was important to understand. Every legal brief, every magistrate statement, every official communication had emphasized this. Excision was a practical administrative measure. Humanity would still exist. Their territorial claims would still be reviewed in absentia through the standard arbitration process. They simply would not have a seat at the table during that process. The representative humanity had sent to the final session was a woman named Dr. Yuan Xiaoyong. She held a position with a title that had taken the Council's translation matrix 4 separate attempts to render, finally settling on something approximate. Director of Extra-Atmospheric Relations Coordination, which was not a government office in the traditional sense, but rather a position created specifically for this purpose by a coalition of 11 of humanity's larger territorial governance structures, each of which had agreed to recognize her authority for this specific event, and this event alone. It was, the Council noted, a rather human solution, technically functional, structurally absurd. Vethanara had watched her during the reading of the resolution. Dr. Yuan had not protested. She had not argued. She had not displayed any of the emotional volatility the Council had somewhat expected. Their behavioral studies suggested humans escalated rapidly under perceived threat, and being formally excised from the galaxy's primary governing body seemed to qualify. Instead, she had sat very still. Her hands were folded on the table in front of her. Her breathing was measured. When the final vote was announced, She had simply nodded once, a small, precise motion, and then she had picked up the acknowledgement stylus and signed the document confirming that humanity recognized the Council's decision. She signed it in the wrong place. Not dramatically wrong, not illegibly wrong, just slightly, almost imperceptibly wrong. Her signature displaced about 4 millimeters from the designated field, overlapping the document's serial boundary marker in a way that technically rendered the signature valid, but made the boundary marker unreadable for automated processing. Vethanara had noticed it in the moment and said nothing, assuming it was an accident, a small human error on a difficult day. She had processed it and filed it. It would not occur to her for another 9 days that it might not have been an error at all. The human delegation departed the council station aboard the same mid-class transport vessel they had arrived in, a ship called the Persistent Argument Asterisk, which even the translation matrix couldn't fully unwrap, generating 3 possible interpretations, none of which made complete sense as a vessel name. They were gone within the hour. The council moved immediately to other business. There were 17 active arbitration cases, 2 membership reviews, and an escalating resource dispute in the Cathara boundary region that had been tabled during the human proceedings. Everything returned to normal. For 9 days. On the morning of the 9th day, a document arrived at the Council's administrative intake system. It was tagged as a legal filing under Protocol 7 of the Standard Arbitration Code, a filing type so rarely used that the intake processor flagged it as a potential formatting error before routing it to a junior clerk named Osvin, whose job was to handle exactly these kinds of administrative anomalies. Osvin opened it, read it again, sent it to his direct supervisor with a message that consisted of only 7 words: "I need someone senior to look at this." His supervisor read it and called the office of the second magistrate. The second magistrate read it and sat very quietly for a long time. Then she said to no one in particular, "Get me Vethanara." The document was 47 pages long in its original human language, which the translation matrix rendered into Council standard in approximately 49 pages due to structural differences in legal syntax. It was signed by Dr. Yuen Sioyon in her capacity as Director of Extra-Atmospheric Relations Coordination, co-signed by representatives of all 11 of the territorial governance structures that had authorized her position, and additionally marked with the authentication seals of a further 63 human governance entities that had not been part of the original coalition, but had formally added their endorsement in the days since the excision vote. 63 additional entities in 9 days. The document's title, translated, was Formal Notice of Territorial Continuity and Claim Escalation under Extra-Council Legal Frameworks, a comprehensive administrative filing. Vethanara read the first page and felt something she rarely felt, a specific variety of cold clarity, the kind that arrives when a pattern suddenly reorganizes itself, and you realize the shape you've been looking at was never the shape that mattered. The humans had not accepted the excision. That was her first reading of it. She was wrong. They had done something considerably more precise. Under Galactic Council Protocol 7, a clause that existed in the original founding charter, written more than 6,000 years ago, and not meaningfully applied in approximately 4,000 of those years, any civilization excised from Council participation retained the right to file territorial and legal claims directly into the Council's arbitration queue, to be processed in strict sequential order, without prioritization or bypass, at the same legal weight as claims filed by full member species. The clause had been written as a protective measure for developing civilizations that might be temporarily excluded for procedural reasons. The logic was sound. You should not be able to permanently strip a civilization of its territorial rights simply by removing its ability to argue for them. What the founders had not anticipated, what no one had anticipated, was a civilization that, upon being excised, immediately filed 4,300 individual territorial claims, one for each of the settlement clusters that had triggered the excision in the first place, plus additional claims for 1,712 regions of contested space that humanity had not previously claimed, but which sat adjacent to or near their existing settlement patterns. 4,300 claims, plus 1,712. Total, 6,012 individual filings, each requiring full arbitration processing under the sequential rules of Protocol 7, each carrying the same legal weight as a claim filed by a full member species, each impossible to deprioritize or dismiss without triggering a precedent that would affect every excised civilization in the Council's history. The Council's arbitration queue had, before this morning, contained 417 active cases. Processing 6,012 additional cases, under strict sequential rules, at the Council's current arbitration throughput, would take. Osvin had done this calculation twice because the first result seemed impossible, between 41 and 58 galactic standard years, during which time, under Protocol 7, humanity's territorial claims could not be altered, reduced, or transferred to other species without a completed arbitration ruling. Every single one of them. All 6,012. Vethinara looked up from the document. "The signature," she said. "The signature," the second magistrate agreed. The boundary marker on the acknowledgement document, the one that Dr. Ewan's displaced signature had made unreadable for automated processing. The boundary marker that, when legible, would have triggered an automatic update in the Council's territorial management system, flagging all of humanity's existing claims as pending review, and temporarily downgrading their legal protection status during the transition period between active participation and excised status. With the boundary marker unreadable, that automatic update had never processed. Humanity's existing territorial protections had remained at full status, and under those full status protections, filed before the system recognized any change in humanity's participation standing, 6,012 claims now sat in queue, fully valid, fully protected, completely immune to the kind of administrative restructuring the Council would have routinely applied during an excision transition. Dr. Ewan had been holding that stylus for a very long time. She'd known exactly where to place her signature. "We need to speak with them," Vethinara said. The second magistrate was quiet for a moment. "We excised them 11 days ago." "I'm aware. They don't have a seat at the table." "No," Vethinara said, "they don't, which means we have to go to them." The silence that followed that realization was the loudest thing in the room. Reaching Dr. Ewan took longer than it should have. Humanity's communication infrastructure was, like everything about human administrative organization, technically functional and structurally absurd. A patchwork of overlapping relay systems, incompatible protocols, and regional nodes that required you to route a message through 3 different intermediary systems before it could reliably reach a specific individual. The Council's communication specialists had sent the initial contact request through their standard interstellar relay system and received, in response, an automated acknowledgement from a system that appeared to be an information management service for an entirely different branch of human governance. It had taken 2 days and a redirect through a human deep space relay station before a response arrived. The response was brief. It confirmed that Dr. Ewan was available for communication. It also noted that she was currently located not at Earth or any of humanity's core systems, but aboard the persistent argument *, which had not, it turned out, returned home. The ship's registered position placed it at the edge of one of the contested boundary regions. Specifically, the region where humanity's 340th filed claim sat in the newly bloated arbitration queue. She was already there. Vesenara thought about that for a moment before opening the channel. When the connection resolved, Dr. Yuan's face was calm. She was seated at a small table, functional, plain, with a cup of something steaming beside her, and behind her, Vesenara could see the dark sprawl of space through a viewport, with something that might have been a planet's curve visible at the edge of the frame. "Counselor," Dr. Yuan said, "I expected your call a few days earlier." "The document required careful review," Vesenara said. She paused. She was, by long professional habit, precise with language, but she found herself choosing words more slowly than usual. "You planned this before the vote." It was not a question. Dr. Yuan did not treat it as one. "I planned it before we were invited to the first session," she said. The cup of steaming liquid sat between them on the screen, untouched. Neither of them moved. "You signed the acknowledgement document incorrectly on purpose," Vesenara said. "The signature was in exactly the right place," Dr. Yuan said, "for what I needed it to do." Vesenara absorbed this. The coalition, the 63 additional governance structures that endorsed the filing in 9 days, you organized that before you arrived. "We organized it over the previous 14 months, Dr. Yuan said. It's difficult to get 63 human governments to agree on anything in less time than that, even when the stakes are clear." A pause. Something moved behind her eyes, not humor, not quite, closer to exhaustion that had made its peace with itself. "Especially when the stakes are clear. You knew you were going to be excised." "We knew there was a strong probability." Dr. Yuan picked up the cup finally, held it with both hands. "Counselor, we've been watching your arbitration queue grow for 6 years. We have people, analysts, researchers, administrators across dozens of governance structures, who have read every word of your founding charter. When you have 400 active cases and a processing throughput that clears roughly 40 cases per year, and you're adding new territorial disputes faster than that, your system has a structural failure point. We could see it. We just needed to decide whether to be on the near side or the far side of it when it collapsed." Vesenara felt the cold clarity again. "You didn't file 6,000 claims to win them." Dr. Yuan was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "No. You filed them to collapse the queue." "We filed them," Dr. Yuan said carefully, "to make a structural problem visible, one that was already there, one that was going to collapse the arbitration system with or without us. We just accelerated the timeline." "To what end?" This time the pause was longer. Dr. Yuan set down the cup. "Counselor," she said, "what happens when the arbitration queue collapses? When there are 6,000 active cases and no realistic path to resolution? When 41 member species have territorial disputes that cannot be adjudicated for 50 years? Vesenara did not answer, because the answer was something she had been deliberately not thinking about for the past 3 days. "The charter requires a governance review," Dr. Yuan said. "A full structural reform process. Every sitting rule, every founding protocol, every participation threshold, open for amendment by all parties with active claims in the system." She picked up the cup again. "All parties, Counselor, including excised civilizations with claims in queue. Under Protocol 7, we have full standing in a governance review, the same standing as any member species." The silence on the channel was so complete that Vesenara could hear, faintly, the hum of the persistent argument s life support systems. "You didn't want a seat at the table," she said. "You wanted to redesign the table." "We wanted to be in the room," Dr. Yuan said, "when the room decides what it's going to be." There were counselors who, when the full implications were explained to them in emergency session the following day, refused to believe it was intentional. They argued, with what Vesenara recognized as the particular desperation of people who needed something to be true, that it was coincidence, that humanity couldn't have planned this far ahead, that their administrative chaos was genuine rather than performed, that the filing was opportunistic rather than strategic. They are a 200-year spacefaring civilization, Ambassador Solantaris said. They barely communicate coherently between their own governance structures. Are we genuinely suggesting that this level of coordinated long-range legal strategy was? The coalition, Vethanara said, includes governance structures from opposite ends of their home planet. Structures that, according to our own observation records from the past 6 years, have been in active territorial dispute with each other for decades. They put aside those disputes specifically to co-sign this filing. All of them, in 9 days. She paused. We didn't think they could organize. We were right. They cannot organize the way we organize, but they organized anyway. They just did it differently. The chamber was quiet. What does that mean? Said a counselor from the Tethani Accord, a species that had been present at the founding and whose institutional memory was longer than most. In practical terms, what does that mean for us right now? It means, Vethanara said, that the governance review is mandatory. It begins in 60 days under charter law, and it means that when it begins, humanity will be in the room with full legal standing. She set her hands flat on the table. And it means that 37 other excised civilization species that have been out of council participation for anywhere between 20 and 800 years are watching what just happened. And every single one of them has the same right to file claims under Protocol 7 that humanity just exercised. The Tethani counselor made a sound that the translation matrix rendered as an intake of breath, associated with sudden comprehension of scale. How many, he said slowly, how many total claims could be filed if all 37 excised civilizations followed humanity's example? Vethanara had had 3 days to prepare herself for saying this number out loud. She had not, it turned out, prepared well enough. Somewhere between 40 and 80,000, she said, depending on how aggressively each civilization interpreted their adjacent claim rights. The chamber did not erupt. It went very quiet, which was worse. Aboard the persistent argument Dr. Ewan received the notification that the governance review had been formally acknowledged and calendared. She forwarded it to a list of 714 contacts, spanning 31 human governance structures and 11 independent human legal advocacy organizations. Then she sent a separate message to a contact the council did not know existed, a woman named Chiamaka Osai, a legal historian based at a human university, who had spent 19 years researching the founding frameworks of species that had later been excised from galactic governing bodies. Chiamaka had been the one to find Protocol 7. She had also found something else, something she and Dr. Ewan had discussed only in person, never in writing, and which Dr. Ewan had decided, after a great deal of careful thought, to use only if necessary, only as a last instrument. The message to Chiamaka was brief: governance review confirmed, 60 days, stand by. Chiamaka's response was even briefer, the others. Dr. Ewan looked at it for a long moment. The planet's curve in the viewport behind her had grown slightly larger. The persistent argument was still moving. She typed, working on it. Then she got up, walked the 12 steps to the ship's communication room, and began the first of what would be 37 separate contact attempts with representatives of excised civilizations, species that had been cut out of the council for decades or centuries, some of whom barely knew humanity existed, some of whom had been observing the proceedings with something that their own translation systems reported resembled disbelief. Some of the calls would take hours. One would take 9 days of relay-negotiated communication and 3 intermediate interpreters. One species had been excised for so long they had internally restructured their entire governmental philosophy twice since their removal, and reaching their current leadership required explaining to them what the Galactic Council currently was before explaining that they still had legal standing in it. Dr. Ewan made every call personally. She had not slept properly in 11 days. There was a particular quality to her eyes on those calls, not the vacancy of exhaustion, but the opposite, the sharpened, slightly luminous alertness of someone who is running on something that isn't rest. The species she called noticed it. Several of them asked in their various ways why she was doing this. Why a human, whose own civilization had only been excised for 11 days, was expending this effort for civilizations whose excision predated human spaceflight. She gave a different answer each time. Not different in substance, different in framing, adjusted for the cultural context of who was asking. To the Vithrani, whose philosophy centered on collective obligation, she spoke about shared standing. To the Dorathi, who had been excised 80 years ago over a territorial dispute that still clearly humiliated them, she spoke about systemic failure of process rather than failure of civilization. To the Sarin Compact, who were deeply suspicious of anything that looked like coordination, she presented it simply as parallel self-interest. They had nothing to lose and potentially a great deal to gain. Vethanara would later conclude after reviewing the communication logs that humanity disclosed during the governance review, extraordinarily good at speaking to people in the language they were already using. The Council's own diplomatic corps had 17 specialized cultural adaptation teams, with a combined staff of over 400, and had never achieved integration results comparable to what Dr. Ewan produced in 37 conversations over 19 days. When Vethanara raised this point during a Council intelligence briefing, a senior analyst offered what he considered a practical explanation. She's from a civilization that contains thousands of distinct cultural and linguistic groups. Adapting communication style to a different audience isn't a specialized skill for humans. It's just Tuesday. On the 41st day after the governance review was calendared, 22 of the 37 excised civilizations filed claims under Protocol 7. The arbitration queue, which had stood at 6,012, jumped to slightly over 61,000. The Council did not go quiet this time. The Council erupted arguments, accusations, emergency sessions, proposals for emergency protocol amendments that were immediately countered by legal challenges from the filing civilizations, who had read humanity's precedent filings with considerable interest in the 19 days since they became public record. A magistrate from the Terethian succession introduced an emergency measure to suspend Protocol 7 pending constitutional review. The measure failed to pass because 14 member species voted against it, and their objections centered on a concern that suspending Protocol 7 would set a precedent that could be used against their own future participation security. The same 14 who had voted against the original excision, the ones who had asked for their votes to not be made public. They had not been protecting humanity, they had been protecting the precedent. They had seen this coming. Not this specifically, but something like it. The structural failure point that Dr. Ewan had described, the collapsing queue, the governance review trigger, it had been visible if you looked at the data with the right concern. Some of the 14 had been looking. Vethanara spent a very long night reviewing those 14 species voting records over the past 50 years. What she found was not a conspiracy. It was something more unsettling than a conspiracy. It was a pattern of quiet, consistent institutional anxiety that no one had ever named out loud. 14 civilizations that had been accumulating concern about the Council's structural durability for decades, each independently, none of them willing to be the first to say it publicly, all of them waiting. Waiting, she realized, for someone to say it first. They had not anticipated it would be humanity. Almost certainly, no one had anticipated it would be humanity. But once it happened, once the claim was filed and the review was triggered and the shape of the thing became clear, 14 species had declined to obstruct it. Because the governance review was something they had privately, quietly wanted for a very long time. Dr. Ewan had not known about those 14. Vethanara was almost entirely certain of this, and confirmed it when the communication logs were later disclosed. There had been no contact between humanity and those 14 species before or during the excision proceedings. She had not needed to know. The structural pressure had done the work. The 14 had simply been sitting in the right position when it arrived. There was a word, in one of humanity's older linguistic traditions, for the moment when a system fails in the direction it was designed to fail, when the breaking point reveals a previously invisible architecture. Vethanara came across it during one of the governance review's preliminary documentation sessions and asked Dr. Ewan about it. Inflection, Dr. Ewan said, or maybe the better word is tipping. When you've been pushing on something for a long time and nothing moves, and then one day you push in exactly the same way and everything moves. And you knew which direction it would move. Dr. Ewan considered this honestly. We knew which directions were possible. We had contingency plans for most of them. A pause. Not all of them. What contingency did you have? Vethanara asked. If the excision vote had failed, if they had kept your seat and refused to excise you. The answer surprised her. We would have asked to be excised voluntarily, Dr. Ewan said. Under Article 14 of the Membership Charter, any member species may request a temporary suspension of participation to address internal governance development needs. We would have filed the claims the same day. The queue collapse is the same regardless of how we arrived outside the room. She picked up her cup. It was always a cup of something hot. Vethanara had begun to think of it as a kind of constant, a small, warm, recurring presence in every conversation. The excision was tidier, less paperwork. The governance review began on day 61, one day late due to a procedural challenge that was resolved overnight. Humanity's delegation arrived with Dr. Ewan at its head and a team of 11 specialists, each from a different human governance structure, each with domain expertise in a different section of the Council's founding charter. They had, Vethanara observed, read the charter more carefully than most current member species. 22 excised civilizations attended with full standing. 14 member species attended as quiet but consistent allies in the procedural arguments. The remaining 375 member species attended in various states of confusion, outrage, reluctant pragmatism, or, in a handful of cases, what the translation matrix could only approximate as relieved that someone finally did this. The review lasted 4.5 standard years. It was, by every available measure, the most contentious governance proceeding in the Council's recorded history. There were days when it seemed to disintegrate entirely, when the procedural arguments became so layered and recursive that the arbitration process meant to govern the review required its own sub-arbitration to resolve disputes about how to resolve disputes. There were moments when 3 or 4 coalitions of species were simultaneously accusing each other of bad faith in languages the translation matrix was rendering with increasing uncertainty. There were 6 separate occasions when a major delegation threatened to withdraw, and on 5 of those occasions, Dr. Ewan's team quietly produced a legal filing that made withdrawal procedurally complicated enough to be not worth the effort. On the 6th occasion, she let them go, watched the delegation stand, gather their materials, begin to leave. They had made it to the corridor when the lead delegate's own legal advisor caught up with them and said something that sent them back to the table. Vethanara never learned what it was. She suspected it was the same information Dr. Ewan had given the advisor, privately, 3 days earlier. Information about what would happen to that species' existing territorial protections if they formally withdrew from an active governance review with pending claims still in queue. The 4.5 years were not without cost. The human delegation worked without the institutional support of the Council's own administrative infrastructure, which was formally unavailable to excised civilizations. They handled their own translation, their own scheduling, their own documentation, a workload that the Council's full member delegations distributed across staffs of dozens, managed by a team that fluctuated between 11 and 15 people depending on who could be released from their home governance responsibilities. 3 members of the human team had health crises during the review. One had to return to Earth for surgery and participated remotely for 4 months, sleeping on an adjusted cycle to align her waking hours with the sessions. One developed a condition that, his physician said, had been exacerbated by sustained stress over a multi-year period, and who continued working with a medication management schedule that Vethanara only learned about afterward. One simply did not stop. Showed up every day for 4.5 years. Never missed a session. Never once asked for a delay on humanity's behalf, though she accepted every procedural delay offered by other parties, because a delay was a day to prepare more thoroughly. That one was Dr. Ewan. Vethanara asked her, near the end of the review, during one of the rare quiet periods between sessions, whether she had known it would cost this much. I knew it would cost something, Dr. Ewan said. I didn't calculate exactly what. You can't really. You can calculate the procedural cost, the time, the resources, the staffing. The math on the queue collapse, the governance trigger, the claim standings, that's just math, and we did it carefully. She was quiet for a moment. Outside the small room they were sitting in, the council station hummed with the quiet machinery of its own vast bureaucratic continuity. But you can't calculate what it costs to be in a room for 4 years where most of the people would prefer you weren't there, and the system you're trying to change is the same system that has to validate every argument you make. You can't put a number on that. You just decide whether it's worth it before you know the price. How do you decide that? Vethanara asked. Dr. Ewan thought about it, a real thought, not a diplomatic pause. You think about the people who aren't in the room, she said. The ones who will be in the next room, after this one, whoever they are, you do the math on them instead. The governance review concluded with the ratification of what the Council's official record labeled the Consolidated Charter Amendment, 47 structural changes to Council participation frameworks, arbitration processing standards, excision protocols, and representation thresholds. It was not everything humanity had asked for. It was not everything any of the excised civilizations had asked for. It was what 4.5 years of procedural combat between 439 civilizations, with full legal standing, produced when no one was able to walk away from the table without consequence. 311 of the 47 member species voted for ratification. The remaining 101 voted against or abstained. The ratification passed. Humanity's excision was formally ended as a direct consequence of the Third Amendment Clause, which restructured participation thresholds in ways that humanity had, without apparent coincidence, already met. 22 formerly excised civilizations received new participation frameworks. Some returned to full membership. Some received associate standing, a new category created by the review that had not previously existed in the Charter. It was not full membership. It was a seat at the table during a limited but specifically defined category of proceedings. It was not nothing. The Durathi, excised 80 years ago, wept during the vote. Their lead delegate stood in the chamber with tears on her face, a physiological response that several council species did not have an equivalent for, and which the translator tried to contextualize and eventually simply flagged as significant emotional response associated with resolution of long-held grievance, and said nothing at all. Just stood there. Let it happen. Dr. Ewan watched from the human delegation's newly restored seats and did not cry. She was very still, the way she had been still during the original excision vote, hands folded on the table in front of her. But the stillness was different now, less compressed. Something had been set down. Later in the corridor, Vethanara stopped her. "The thing Chayamaka found," she said. "The other instrument, the one you didn't use." Dr. Ewan looked at her steadily. "You found the communications." The disclosure process was thorough. A pause, yes. What was it? Dr. Ewan looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, a precedent from the Council's founding era before the current charter language was finalized. A draft provision that was removed during the third revision cycle. If it had remained in the final charter, it would have given any civilization with active arbitration claims the right to demand a full membership review, not just a governance review triggered by any queue backlog exceeding a certain threshold. She paused. The threshold it specified was 4,000 cases. Vethinara was quiet. A full membership review, she said carefully, would have allowed challenges to existing member species standing. Yes, that would have been catastrophic, Dr. Ewan said, destabilizing in ways that would have taken decades to repair, species that have held membership for centuries being forced into requalification proceedings. The resulting uncertainty in territorial protection status alone would have triggered secondary disputes that, she stopped. We weren't going to use it. It was a last instrument if the governance review had failed completely. If they had found a way to void the Protocol's 7 filings and collapse the process without the amendments, it was the thing we had that we hoped we'd never have to hold. You were willing to use it, Vethinara said. Dr. Ewan did not answer immediately. Her eyes were very clear. Not cold, never cold, which was its own kind of unsettling. Just clear. The clarity of someone who has calculated a number they don't like and accepted it. We were willing to do what was necessary to be in the room, she said finally. What we used was the minimum necessary, that's all I can tell you. We tried very carefully to make sure it was the minimum. A pause. I think we succeeded. I think the cost was the right cost. Not a small cost, but the right one. She walked away down the corridor, back toward the human delegation's offices, which were functional, plain, and decorated with exactly one object that no one had commented on but everyone had noticed. A small, framed image of Earth, not the whole planet, not the iconic full globe view, but a close image of a coastline. A specific coast, unnamed in the frame. An ordinary stretch of shore that could have been anywhere. Vethinara had looked at it once, early in the review, and thought it was a strange choice for an ambassador's office decoration. She had later understood that it wasn't a symbol. It wasn't a statement about humanity or home or origin or any of the abstract things it might have represented. It was a specific place. It meant something specific to a specific person who had decided it was worth putting on the wall. That was all, that was enough. In the months that followed, the Council's institutional memory specialists produced an official historical analysis of the governance crisis and its resolution. The analysis ran to several hundred pages. It identified the queue collapse, the Protocol 7 mechanism, the Charter Amendment trigger, the coalition building across excised civilizations, the role of the 14 dissenting member species, and the 4.5-year review process in meticulous procedural detail. It did not fully explain the thing that Vethinara had spent the better part of 5 years trying to understand. Not because the analysts lacked information, the disclosure process had been thorough, but because the thing she wanted explained was not, ultimately, procedural. It was this. The Council had been a functional institution for 6,000 years. It had encountered, by its own records, 44 civilizations that were assessed as unlikely to achieve meaningful participation. Some of those civilizations had simply accepted the assessment and remained on the periphery. Some had protested and been overridden. A handful had attempted resistance, through various means, legal, political, occasionally military, and had been absorbed, redirected, or managed out of relevance. None of them had done this. Not because they lacked the intelligence to find Protocol 7, not because they lacked the legal capacity to file the claims. Several of them, the historians concluded after review, had the necessary information available and simply had not used it. The question was why. Vethinara had a theory. which she kept out of official documents because she couldn't prove it, and which she thought about occasionally, alone, the way you think about things you can feel the edge of but can't fully hold. The other civilizations had been willing to fight for a seat at the table. They had not been willing to risk destroying the table to get it. They had looked at what would have to be done, the queue, the review, the years of procedural combat with no guaranteed outcome, holding the chaos instrument of the founding-era provision in reserve, and had made a rational calculation that the risk was not worth it. That the damage to their relationships, their standing, their future diplomatic position in a council they hoped to one day rejoin would be too great. They had been too invested in the existing structure to break it open, even when the structure had broken them. Humanity had been in the council for less than a century. They had no long diplomatic history with the member species, no centuries-old relationships to protect, no institutional memory of what the council's goodwill had once been worth and might be worth again. They had arrived too recently to have accumulated the thing that was, in the end, the most powerful force maintaining the old structure, the loss of what they already had. They had almost nothing to lose, and they had calculated with extraordinary care exactly how little they needed. It was not that humanity was stronger, or smarter, or more strategically sophisticated than the species that had tried before and failed. It was that humanity had not yet learned to stop. There was no tradition in their short galactic history of accepting that a structure was permanent, no cultural memory of 6,000 years of council dominance making the council feel inevitable. They had looked at the oldest governing body in the galaxy, a system that had existed for longer than humanity had had cities, and had simply asked themselves how it worked, read every word, found the place where the weight was resting, and pushed. Not because they were fearless, because they were, Vethanara had come to believe, constitutionally incapable of accepting that the answer was no when the question hadn't been asked correctly yet. The stylus had been warm because she had been holding it, for the entire proceeding, as if it were the most important object in the room. Because it was. Because she had known, from the moment it was placed in front of her, exactly what it needed to do. She had sat in a chamber where 412 civilizations, representing thousands of years of institutional history, had looked at humanity and seen a species too disorganized to govern itself, too fragmented to constitute a coherent political entity, too new to understand how these things worked. She had signed in exactly the right place. And then she had walked out of the room and gone to work. The galaxy, it would eventually come to understand, had made an error that was very difficult to correct once you saw it clearly. It had looked at humanity's chaos and seen weakness. It had not considered that an organism which had survived, for its entire existence, inside its own chaos, which had built every road, every agreement, every grudging coalition in its history out of the raw material of its own fragmentation, might experience that chaos not as a vulnerability but as a native environment. A place where it knew, better than anyone watching from the outside, exactly how to move. The asterisk persistent argument was still out there, somewhere near the boundary region, its position updated in the Council's navigation records now that humanity had full standing again. It had not returned to Earth even after the review concluded. Dr. Yuan had filed 3 additional legal briefs from aboard it in the weeks since ratification, standard procedural matters, transition framework negotiations, the kind of careful follow-through that ensured the amendments were implemented as written rather than as interpreted. The ship's name still generated 3 possible translations, none of them entirely wrong, none of them entirely right. The stylus Vethanara had kept, she wasn't sure why. It sat on her desk where she occasionally picked it up, held it, set it down again. It was a plain thing, standard ceremonial materials. There was nothing remarkable about it except what had been done with it. She thought, sometimes, about the coastline image on Dr. Yuan's office wall. The unnamed shore, The specific place that meant something to a specific person who had decided it was worth carrying across the galaxy and putting on a wall in a room full of people who were trying to keep her out. Humanity had not won because they were the strongest species in the galaxy. They had not won because they were the most advanced, or the most organized, or the most strategically gifted. Dozens of species could claim equivalence or superiority on every one of those measures. They had won, if one was even the right word for what had happened, for the thing that had cost 5 years and the health of 3 people, and the perpetual exhaustion of one woman who had never once asked the table to feel sorry for her. Because they had decided, somewhere in the long calculation before any of this began, that the cost of stopping was higher than the cost of continuing. And they had simply not stopped. In a galaxy full of civilizations that had learned, through long accumulated experience, when to accept that a door was closed, humanity remained persistently, irrationally, exhaustingly, the species that kept asking what the door was made of, and whether it had a second side.